Shalom, welcome everyone to our program today in honor of Shabbat Shirah. We're going to hear from Hazzan Matt Austerklein, a lecture on music theology, the many Torahs of music. For those of you who don't know Hazzan Austerklein, I'll give you a little introduction. So Matt is a prayer leader, a musician, a scholar, exploring the religious meaning of Jewish musical forms. A congregational cantor for over a decade, Matt has worked in diverse pastoral, life cycle, and educational settings. He serves as a mentor to new and student cantors and works on projects shaping the Jewish musical future. Matt is a multi-genre artist of contemporary and classic Jewish music. He is currently a PhD candidate in Jewish studies, and I'm going to say this wrong, at the Halle-Wittenberg University. Is that correct? All right. In Germany, where he is writing his dissertation on the professionalization of Ashkenazi cantors in early modern Europe. Hazzan Matt Austerklein is married to Rabbi Alyssa Austerklein, and he has 2 children and currently lives in Akron, Ohio. But the most important thing to know about Matt is that he grew up here at Agudas Achim congregation and is the son of our beloved members, Paul Klein and Barbara Elkin. So please help me welcome Hazzan Matt Austerklein.
Hi, everybody. Doing a program for one's home synagogue. Even though I spend a lot of time lecturing online like an academic, it sort of feels like, I'm in just the living room of people who, many of whom I grew up with. So I just want to offer thanks for everyone who has been part of my journey, that's part of this lecture, and everyone who's come today. Since this is Shabbat Shirah, and since this is a lecture about music, I never like to talk about music without actually engaging in the practice of it. So this is a melody, and I welcome you to learn it and join in it with me. Hidi dum dum die yo, hidi dum dum die yo, hi ay 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 ay, hidi dum dum die yo, hidi dum dum die yo, ay 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 ba bye bye, hidi dum dum die yo, hidi dum dum die yo. Ay 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 ba bye bye, hidi dum dum die yo, hidi dum dum die yo. Ay 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 ba bye bye, hidi dum dum die, hidi da da die die ay. Oy 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 ba bye bye, hidi dum bum bum, hidi ba bum bye ay. Ay 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 ba bye bye, hidi dum dum die, hidi da da dum die yo. Oy 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 da die die, hidi dum dum die, hidi da da dum die yo. Ay 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 ba bye bye, hidi dum dum die yo, hidi dum dum die yo. Ay 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 ba bye bye, hidi dum dum die yo, hidi dum dum die yo. Ay 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 ba bye bye, hidi bum bum bye, hidi da da dan die die. Ay oy oy ba bye bye. You can just sing oy 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 with me. Jews love to sing oy. Hidi dum bum bye, hidi oy 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 oy, oy 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 oy. Oy 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 oy, oy 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 oy. Oy 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 oy, oy 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 oy, oy 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 oy, oy 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 oy, oy ay ay ay. Oy, oy, oy. Home. Thanks for being part of this instant Zoom singing community. I'm sure you've been parts of many versions of this, especially in shul, of a time. Um, that is a Duror Yikra, which also works for Adon Olam, which I wrote. Synagogue life over the pandemic has been a little more spotty, but what has not been spotty is being at home for Shabbat. And so I found myself writing a lot of melodies for Shabbat Zmirot, for songs we would sing at home with our kids and family. So I want to open my talk now that we've been engaged in the practice of music, and we've been added to our practice by the passing over of a plane coming into Fort Myers Airport, live here from Fort Myers, Florida. You can see the low lighting because I'm outside on the lanai. But I want to open with a question, and this is the question, and you can just put the answer in the chat that comes to mind. And the question is this: what does music do? Not what is music, but what does it do? What work does it accomplish? What does it create that was not there before it happened? You can take a moment. We have answers from your hearts will populate the chat. Calms, connects us with our emotion. It connects us, it brings us into community. It creates a spiritual space, right? A space where both the emotions and the sense of purpose are manifest. It can relax us. It can excite us. It has a deep power over our emotions. It sets an ambiance, right? It touches our hearts, activates emotional centers. Absolutely, absolutely. So we see a lot here about the power of emotion and the ability of music to channel it. We have the power of music to connect us to each other in different ways. And really as a therapeutic and a reflective process. It can give perspective. It can make you open up to something that you were in your fix everything mode, and then you got into a music state of mind, and you were like, oh, I'm thinking about things so differently because I'm in an more open-minded or transcendent state of being. So, and also importantly, it connects us with memory, because if you've ever been with someone with memory loss in the hospital or in life, or just knowing from your own life, that music connects us with some of our earliest understandings of self, some of our earliest things, sounds that define us. Even the heartbeat, ba-bum, 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 can be mapped onto the way that we experience music today. So I think that what all of these answers have really brought forth is that music is operating on us consciously and unconsciously in expressing deeper truths about the world. Often we think that music is a question of taste. He likes this, she likes that. It's like a personal choice, right? Or one's desire for music is the product of your youth. But today, I actually want to push beyond that level and to get a little bit deeper and expose some of the things beyond taste. That is the theological and social and even the political visions or worlds that emerge through different musical experiences and genres. Now, many of these deeper questions I find, forget. We hear something we like and we say, oh, that's spiritual. And then we hear something we don't like and say, oh, that's a performance. But there's so much in that, right? We say, okay, well, that's a performance. What is a performance? At my shul, what mitzvot are being performed at the service, and how? How did the music facilitate the performance of those mitzvot? Because it's not like we don't value performance, and it's not that that there's only one way to spirituality. In fact, I think for me, and this is part of the title of tonight's talk, is that there's not just one Torah of music. It's not just the Torah came and it said, this is the way you should sing. It's not like that. Music has many forms and has its own Torah to teach us in its different forms, from its most simple to its most complex, from its most Western to its most Eastern. As a famous philosopher once put it, and here I will do the sacred sharing of the screen. Okay. You see the screen? Yes. Mit the Jiden on the links and Wing on the rechts. We have the choir and the guitar and the accordion. Very good, yes? Okay. Okay. All right, now I will try to play the slideshow. And, okay. We see it? The connection is there. That's what I always want to say, Hazzan, that the connection is there. Okay. Well, this is how the great philosopher once put it this way when we talk about music and meaning. Music is an unconscious exercise in metaphysics in which the mind is unaware that it is philosophizing. Say it again so you can steepen it. Music is an unconscious exercise in metaphysics in which the mind is unaware that it is philosophizing. So we may have an experience of music, but the experience is actually an experience of politics, arts, social realities, so much more than just the sound. And with that, let's dive into a bunch of different sources to explore how Torah sees music and how music evokes many Torahs of its own. Now we're going to begin today with two Jewish texts in a good yeshivish, in a good sort of yeshiva style, which treat on the state of the world and see what meaning they give us about the practice of music. This first one comes from Parashat Bereshit, the generations of Cain. Can I get a volunteer who is comfortable with whatever the size of the font this is on their screen to read this story? If you can, I don't know if we can give you permission to unmute. Elishev, it may be easiest for you to do this, Hazzan, but if there's someone else who would like to volunteer, I would welcome them to read the story.
If you're interested, please raise your hand virtually, not in the Zoom box, and I will unmute you.
Very good. Now, I will just add, while we are finding that person, I will give some context. Genesis 4, the generation, is the story of the generations of Cain. Cain has just killed Abel, and God has said to Cain, or Cain as he's known in Hebrew, you're going to wander, and no one's going to kill you because I'll put that mark on you. And this is what Cain does right after that. This is the history of his line 7 generations down. So with that backdrop of the first murder, Oy Vezmir.
Okay, we don't seem to have
Let's see.
Here.
That's okay.
But
people have very comfortable couches, and I don't blame them. It's good. Yes, would you please read? Please read.
Sure. Okay. Cain left the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, right? I need to look at it in the Hebrew. Okay.
It's Chanoch, but Enoch.
Chanoch. That's what it is. Okay, Chanoch. Oh, that's what it is. Okay, Chanoch. And he then founded a city and named the city after his son Chanoch. To Chanoch was born Irad, and Irad begot Mehuyael, and Mehuyael bat Methuzael, and Methuzael begot Lamech. A lot of names here. Okay. Lamech took to himself 2 wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the name of the other was Zillah. Adah bore Yabal. He was the ancestor of those who dwell in tents and amidst herds. And the name of his brother was Yuval. He was the ancestor of all who play the lyre and the pipe. As for Zillah, she bore Tubal-Cain, who forged all implements of copper and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, O wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. I have slain a man for wounding me, and a lad for bruising me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Shet, meaning, God has provided me with another offspring in place of Havel, for Cain had killed him. And to Shet, in turn, a son was born, and he named him Enosh. It was then that men began to invoke the Lord by name.
Thank you so much. This is a very deep story, and we could get really into detail about it. But let's just talk. I'm going to just comment briefly because we have a couple other things to look at tonight. What have we learned? We learned that Cain, who has been condemned to wander, is actually a city builder. He is the ancestor, indeed, it seems, of all city builders. 7 generations later, we have reached Lamech, who is incidentally the first polygamist, and his 3 sons, who are responsible for the many markers of what I would call technical civilization, right? We have Yaval, who's the ancestor of those who know how to do animal husbandry. And we have Yuval, who is the ancestor of all who know how to play the lyre and the pipe. And Tuval Cain, who is the ancestor of those who know metallurgy. Again, these are the core parts of ancient civilization, the core powers, the core tech. So music here is coming in under the context of the core text, not core text, that's Jewish, the core technology of building a civilization. Now, we should note the contrast here with many polytheistic and pagan mythologies, Greek, Hindu, Native American, and otherwise, for which music is actually a divine creative force, like fire, given over and championed by the gods themselves. Not the case in the Torah. Music does not come from God, it comes from people. And at the end of all this civilizational advance, what does Lamech, the father of all these, tech giants, what does he say? He says, Ada betzila shema'an koli, nishen levechazina imrati, ki haragti ish lefitzi, v'yed lechaburati, im shivatayim yukam kayim v'lemech shiv'im v'shiv'ah. Yes, we have just heard the first song in the entire Bible, and ladies and gentlemen, it is gangster rap. A swaggering polygamist boasting about being violent and vengeful, and even more powerful than God. This is the moral condition of the first song in the Torah. And we should note well the coda of this story. We saw that Adam, after the song, which is epic boasting, like classic, Epic of Gilgamesh and stuff like that, Adam knows his wife again. They have a new son named Shet, and Shet has their first grandkid called Enosh. And Enosh is a word that means human. It emphasizes human frailty and human vulnerability. And it's then that people begin to call out to God. In this context, we could learn that music for the Israelites, and I might be saying something unpopular because we love music. I'm a Cantor, Hazzan's a Cantor, like we love this, is not divine in the Torah. It is technology. And like all products of technical civilization, it can be used for good or evil. In this case, we may be impressed by it, along with all these other forms of human ingenuity, but it's not a guarantee of enosh, of humility, or of morality, or of a covenant with God. This next text that I'm going to share with you is a midrash, and it gets to the question of what this world that we are living in is. Is it a house that's glowing and beautiful, or is it a building on fire? And we might wonder how we might see this reflected in music. This is a midrash that actually in the rabbinic tradition shows up many different times and in different iterations. Let me show you 2 contrasting ones that turn on the meaning of 2 Hebrew words. And I want to thank Rabbi Aviva Richmond of Hadar Institute. I was a fellow with them and she taught me these midrashim. So here it says, they're talking about Parshat Lech Lecha, about how did Abraham find faith. And here it says that Abraham engaged in analogical thinking, and he said, if a person is traveling in the desert and found a building aglow, a bira doleket, would it be possible to say that this building did not have masters? So too, it is impossible that this world and skies have no leader and no creator. So this iteration of the midrash, Abraham finds faith because he realizes, deep down in the world is order. The spiritual life, therefore, of Abraham is coming into alignment with this very truth. These are the theological antecedents of things like natural design theory and other theologies that emphasize the inherent, and even Kabbalah, that emphasize the inherent order of the universe and the spiritual life as one who realizes how actually everything is okay. But there's an earlier version of this midrash, not that one is better or worse, a different version, an earlier version, in which Abraham has a different experience. It says, what is Abraham's faith like? It's like a person who's traveling from place to place who saw a birah doleket, same words, but here understood as a building on fire. He said, one would conclude that this building has no leader. The owner of the building peeked out and said to him, I am the owner of the building. So too, since Abraham, our ancestor, was saying, one would conclude that this world has no supervisor, brackets, it's on fire. The Holy Blessed One peeked out and said to him, I am the owner of the entire world. This Abraham is not finding spirituality from order. This Abraham is finding spirituality because he looks out and sees that the world is a mess. It's on fire. It's having horrible problems. How could you constantly look at this and think that there's, and the word here is manhig, that there's a building with literally no supervisor. Manhig is actually a technical term from back then for the super of like a Mishnaic tenement building. But the owner of the building peeks out. And so Abraham's spiritual life is actually a relationship with God in protest to the way things are, in protest to the mess that's out there. Now, we might be attracted to different reads on this story, and they both exist in Jewish theology, in the Torah. They both exist in the Torah and the Hebrew Bible in parallel, and in rabbinic literature to come. Now, we might see or think about how different experiences of music emphasize these different ways of viewing the world. Often they even coexist with one another. There are also philosophies that coexist on either parallel in our political systems, in our even theologies, even in the most basic way we live our lives. This question that we're looking at, is the world harmony, order, or perfection, or is it disharmony, chaos, or imperfection, is really the question of the spirituality of the question, is everything okay? Is it all really okay? Or Nebuch, is it all really not okay? And we have to do something. We should consider how we respond, actually, to this question in music. Now, what does he mean? Okay. Oh, there's two slides. There we are. One for the left side, one for the right side. Equal opportunity graphics. There we go. Ever had a book? Please don't tell LeVar Burton I put a keep on his head. It's okay, but he doesn't know about it. Ever have a book that you read and it sticks in your head like forever? So mine is Aaron Vildavsky's book on the right, Moses as Political Leader. Vildavsky's basic premise is this, that Moshe's genius was that he moved the Israelites from unacceptable forms of government, tyranny and anarchy, and to acceptable ones, equity, a word we know a lot about today, and hierarchy, another word we know a lot about today. So journey with me and let's think about Jewish music leadership in terms of these two types of musical government, musics of equity and musics of hierarchy. Play with me for a little bit this evening. Let's start with the music of equity. This is, by the way, is a graphic from Vildavsky's book about how equity works as in politics and in government. Let's see if this sounds familiar. This type of music, and this is my characterization, so you can like it or not. Music of equity isn't for everybody, but it's intensely practiced by groups of people with shared values. These people sing together with shared expectations, where everybody's voice is equal in the singing experience. Every individual in the group is important, and they should follow the dictum, Al tifrosh min hatzibur, do not separate yourself from the community. Decisions are made either by consensus or through the charismatic leadership of the facilitator. That facilitator, when trusted, has near unlimited power to control the journey of the music, provided that he or she observes the rules of equity. If she steps out of line, she could lose all trust and authority like that, because her charisma and leadership lies in the trust and purity of her mission and motives. Does this sound like any musical experiences you've heard of? Obviously, I'm suggesting a few on the screen. Does it sound like any Torah you've studied, though? For me, it's very familiar because this is the Torah of prophetic leadership. It's what the Nevi'im, the prophets, were shooting for. They were meant to be pure and serve God and critiqued everybody, and it didn't matter your station in life. We are all equally loved and valued before Hashem, and therefore our voices are equally heard and valued before Hashem. But it's not the whole story. See if this found familiar. Music of hierarchy. This type of music is putatively for everybody. It represents something timeless, culturally normative, or binding for the masses. The revelation of the music flows through composers to interpreters and then through them unto the masses of people. Musical leaders don't have an unlimited mandate. They can't do just anything, but they do not require unanimity or charisma because their position invests them in authority. In the extreme, they will be overthrown by the masses if their excesses get too disconnected from their mandate to make music for all. Does this sound like any music you've heard of? Of course, I'm suggesting a bunch of things on the screen. You can agree with them or disagree with them. But for me, this is Torah too. Whose Torah? It is priestly Torah. This is how the Kohanim and Leviim worked. Now, the dynamic between hierarchy and equity we find all over the Tanakh. It's not just something we find in music, but the propensity towards one or the other are two dialectic poles of how Jews are to be religious. And we find this wonderfully expressed in the life of none other than King David, which is written about in two places, with one with an equity view and one with a hierarchy view. The book of Samuel and the book of Chronicles. Now, think of the life of David HaMelech. Here are two accounts. In Samuel, a prophetic book, we learn that David did some great things, but we learn all about his sins. He is lazy with the holy ark. He puts it on a cart, and this isn't a haftarah. You have to teach kids about why did this guy die? Because the ark fell over, right? But they put it on the cart instead of holding it. Bad procedure. David was lazy with that. A man died because of it. David dances lewdly in front of slave girls and purposefully humiliates himself, alienating himself in perpetuity from his wife Michal. We know this just from one scene in 2 Samuel 6, which are at pains to include David's sins. And we know also from Bathsheba and all the other stuff that comes later. Now, this prophetic view of David reminds the reader that even and especially the king is not above reproach. Everyone is equally loved and seen and judged by God, no matter who they are. But in Chronicles, Divrei Hayamim, a very different picture. It's kind of like changing a news station. I don't know if you ever had a particular news thing that you watch and you're like, wow, the coverage is really very, very different between that station and that station. I'm sure we've all had this experience with some sorts of news, if not many sorts of news these days. In Chronicles, David HaMelech is idealized. In the same story that I described of the ark coming to Jerusalem, his self-profanation and mistakes with the ark are vaguely alluded to, and others are omitted completely. And he is celebrated for his involvement with musical instruments and singers. This reflects, by the way, the overall approach of the Book of Chronicles, which I would call the cantorial history of the Torah. It's a cantorial history of the Jewish people. The overall approach of Chronicles, which is like that of our Siddur, is that David was a musical wonder. He united the Israelites in the Davidic monarchy. He put us on the road to the temple. He wrote Tehillim and prayers. He introduced musical instruments and choirs into the worship of God. He was a superhero. He was great, right? It's why we have that, the David Hallelujah song. We look up to him. We need him as a symbol. And you can bet that also in Chronicles is where you find all of the names of these elite temple choir and orchestra members, important players in David's ideal, musically enhanced worship of God. And this is the approach, really, of the priest, who longs to see the ideal, not to avoid the prophetic and the real, but to keep the ideal as his inspiration, rather than focus on all of the messy underbelly of things. Two ways of leading: prophetic and priestly, moving towards equity, moving towards hierarchy. Sometimes pure, but also most often which coexist in life, in prayer, in music. Both Jewish, as we see, both with a positive and a negative side. Musics of hierarchy, like regular hierarchies in politics and otherwise, are stable. But when they're unwatched and they're uncultivated, they rot into decadence and sin and even musical tyranny. Just look at the prophet's critique of the temple service, particularly around times of communal sin like Yom Kippur. We read the prophet saying, you think it's just about the forms, but you've forgotten the substance. You've forgotten the seed that grew the forms. Musics of equity are purer and more equal and indeed invoke the spontaneous voice of God as prophetic things do. As we see, remember the prophet Elisha uses music to bring on ecstatic states of prophecy. But these musics, like equities in the world, are also more unstable and perhaps more easily fall apart through anarchic instincts. Think here of the ecstatic dance music of the golden calf idolatry riot of Exodus 32. Where God observes, Vayomer en kol anot gevura, en kol anot chadusha, kol anot anochi shome'eh. It's not the sound of the tune of triumph or the sound of the tune of defeat. It's the sound of song I hear. Now, why am I telling you all this? Sounds nice and intellectual, blah. Because musical choice is not just about taste. Hey, you like this, I like that. We'll put it together. We'll have a community. It's actually about Torah. What is the music teaching? What forms of human community are being modeled by my musical choices and my leadership choices? So, I can break. There's a lot of content that I probably just thought. I can break for a question or two if you like, or I can keep going. Hazzan, what do you think?
We can take a question if someone, but everybody has to raise their hand virtually. And then I can call on you. Or you can put a question in the chat if you prefer. So we'll just take a minute or maybe less.
Yes. Sorry, to get the chat more visible to me, I'm going to there we go. Sorry, I just need to get it outside of where I can actually see it. There we go.
Okay. I don't see any hands raised.
It's okay. We can talk more at the end. I just wanted, I know that sometimes when I talk, we talk about a lot, and it's good to digest.
That's okay. Let's go on.
Okay, moving on. Now, a coda on the figure of David. In Renaissance Italy, some Jewish thinkers who had been exposed to Western music theory actually wrote significant treatises on the nature of music in the temple, seeking to prove the merit of music theory as a Jewish science. As the 12th century poet Emmanuel of Rome, a Jewish contemporary of Dante, wrote, there's a crazy thing he wrote in like the 1100s, Ma omeret chokhmat hamuzika el hanotzrim, ganov ganuvti me'eretz ha'ivrim. What does this mean? What does the art of music, or the science of music, right, like the Western one, say to the Gentiles? Surely I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews. Which is this Dante contemporary, as Emmanuel is saying, this Western music you think is so good, it used to be ours. You just stole it from us, along with other things. But I digress. One of these theorists of temple music, right, which was named Yehuda Moscato. And in his book, De Putzot Yehuda, he relates a sermon on the spirituality of music, in which, in the context of praising harmony and music theory, he writes about King David as a more realistic role model for regular people instead of someone like Moses. And he says, is piety a small thing? No, for Moses, it's a small thing. But God would not ask of every one of the children of Israel a perfect degree of piety by one standard. See, he's so pluralist and inclusive. That everything should be according to the way a man is and how much is possible from him in preparation. And later he says, it is King David who attempts in making his choices to make his playing to perfection. And when he said that it was written that David's lyre would play itself in the Torah, is an allusion to the effortlessness of the action. What happened is that David craved to be accustomed to an upright path in such a manner as to walk on it without effort. So to me, the main point is this. This teaching of Moscato hints to the taste of the chronicler's spirituality, that David is an imperfect figure. As a hierarchical figure, as a king, he's imperfect. But he craved to be accustomed to the upright path. Even though it started from a place of sin. Farther from the steering prophetic stones of Mount Sinai, which only the prophet Moses could walk with great closeness to God, David is held up as this model of imperfection and aspiration, other things you find in hierarchies. This is as much to say as hierarchical musical figures and hierarchical music and hierarchies in general are perhaps more tolerant and inclusive of human flaws, uniting people under an ideal rather than bringing them close to the prophet's judgment. This is their boon and also shows their proclivity towards permissiveness and rot. In fact, if you think about it, and this, I'm sure I'll get comments on this, you can think about this in politics today. The right typically has problems associated with hierarchies, over-reliance on received structures, and tolerance of internal rot, and the left associated with equities, unstable leadership moored with judgmentalism and anarchic tendencies. So, didn't mean to get so political. I promise there's beautiful music coming. But again, as I say when it comes to music, everything is about everything. So let's get deeper into some of these embedded contrasts in the musics of hierarchy and equity, which go back to those theologies of the Bira Doleket in rabbinic literature. Here, let me take you between the dichotomy of music and noise. And we're going to look at the masters of the musics of harmony, started by Pythagoras all those years ago. Ingrid, if Barry is there, I'm sure his ear is just moving because he heard the word Pythagoras, who knows way more about it than me. Let's look at those masters of the music of harmony, the Christians, as they saw music in their own worship and in ours. Now, let's start with the Christians and their own music. Let's get this to play. Good. Beautiful singing. The internet, you get all these great choirs now. They can become superstars and they sing beautifully. So for the Catholics in this era, particularly under the influence and writings of St. Augustine, might suggest the following music theology, at least to me. The Catholic world would say back then, the world is in harmony. Its brokenness is resolved by the sacrifice of Jesus of Nazareth, which has redeemed the whole world, bringing the kingdom, of God. Music theory is in this way a reinforcement of the cosmic order that God has resolved through this sacrifice, and so using well-tuned, well-ordered music, we will evoke the natural beauty and harmony of God's created world. Music punctuated by silence, facilitated by the grand spaces in which a lot of worship was done, is the fundamental soundscape of the medieval and Renaissance church, under which Ashkenazi Jews grew up. Now, there's more to say, but let's hear how these same Christians, right around the same time as Monteverdi here, how they saw the music of Jews. This is from the Commedia dell'arte, musical comedy La Mi Farnasso, by the famous Italian writer Orazio Vecchi. Actually, Leon de Modena, who was a big fan of Salomone Rossi's work and helped get it published, actually set a poem to one of Vecchi's tunes back in the early 17th century. In this scene, you're going to hear a comic character, Francatripa. You'll hear him sound weird at the beginning, trying to get some Jews to do business with him, only to realize that they are praying in their house on Shabbat. So listen closely to what these Jews sound like in early 17th century Christian comedy. Okay. Oops, I want to make sure that plays. Good.
Va agli ebrei, Francatrippa a porre un pegno. La porta forte scuote e una babelle sode di voci e orribili favelle.
This is the folks knocking on the door of the Jews. The Jews, listen to their Hebrew. So, that was cute, right? I think I may be the first, I hope I'm the last person to play anti-Semitic music to you as part of a synagogue lecture, but that's what that is. That's one of a genre of what are called Jew songs. We actually have an example, about 11 of those from that time. So what do we notice about the Jews? We notice they sound not just nasal, and they're undering random syllables. Actually, interestingly, Baruch Haba, which you heard, La Baruch Haba, was very well known because brisses were done in public, and they would hear everyone go Baruch Haba. And in fact, the term Baruch Haba is even used in like violin things, in the 19th century, even divorced from that original context. But here's the main point: not are the Jews only the Jews nasal, but they're also disordered. You can hear an Italian phrase for making a ruckus, fare sinagoga. They're making a synagogue up in there. All throughout Jewish history, at least Catholics at this period, and even later, other types of Christians, hear and see Jewish sound for ideological and other reasons as noise. This is part of a bigger idea that Jewish music, or noise, was unharmonious, insincere, manipulative, materialistic, or in some way other morally or spiritually dangerous. This idea helped to produce, and was also produced by, the Western musical tradition. And they actually thought this about cantors as well. So I am going to extend this because I have to read this to you. Charles Burney visits Amsterdam in 1775, and he goes to the synagogue of the German Jews, and at that time they are using what are called mishorim, which are still used today in some form, where you have a bass and then a child singer. And he says, "At my first entrance, one of the priests was chanting part of the service in a kind of ancient canto fermo, and reproofs were made to the congregation in manner which resembled the hum of bees." Jews sounding like bees is like a normal way that Christians would talk about experiences of the synagogue, because they would hear stuff they would hear in a davening setting. After this, 3 of the sweet singers of Israel, which it seems are famous here, and much attended to by Christians as well as Jews, begin singing kind of a jolly modern melody, sometimes in unison and sometimes in parts with a kind of told it all instead of words, which to me seem very farcical. One of the voices was like a falsette, more like the upper part of a bad vox humana stop in an organ than a natural voice. And he goes on complaining about these guys sounding very silly and very, very much like noise. Now, if you're interested more in this, I highly recommend Ruta Cohen's book, The Music Libel Against the Jews, which came out, I believe, in 2011, which really documents this phenomenon of Christian harmony versus Jewish noise for the entirety of that relationship. A really fascinating and telling book. But let's think about this deeper, I say. Why did art, music, and musical complexity develop in Catholic religious contexts rather than in Jewish ones? Certainly there's a matter of the suppression of Jews, but also overall cultural distinction and the money and the power and the institutions of Christian life. But to my mind, and from my own instinct, there's a deeper teaching here that we actually should think about. And it has to do with chiyuv. It's a Hebrew word for obligation. I asked a colleague who's a Catholic theologian, is there a Catholic obligation to daven? Is there a Catholic obligation to pray? And this theologian replied that halachically, according to church canon law, no, there is no Catholic obligation to prayer. It's not a sacrament. The only ones who have voted prayer obligations are the nuns and later the priests. In short, in Jewish terms, there's no general chiyuv to daven. they don't have to go, not everyone has to go pray. And so if there's no chiyuv to daven, who is the worship for? It is for God. It doesn't ultimately matter if the people are there. The church is doing specialized adornment of the prayers to honor God. And so because religious music serves an overwhelmingly priestly function for God, it can become sophisticated and specialized because it does not require public musical participation. But for rabbinic Jews, traditionally, everyone has a chiyuv to daven. Prayer is for God, and its beauty and execution are important, but it's foundationally there to empower every Jew to have a relationship with God, not just the specialized ones. This is, by the way, for Ashkenazi Jews, of which American synagogues are predominantly the inheritors of, the root of davening, of that hum of people all praying musically together, the hum of bees, right? Which is really not the hum of bees. It's the sound of individual empowerment and individual obligation and relationship to God. Indeed, when the empowerment of the Kahal to daven began to rot in post-war America, leaders of the Cantors Assembly, like its 40-year leader Sam Rosenbaum, sounded the alarm. This essential interplay between cantor and congregation through communal davening was dying, leaving a deadly silence. Silence, in my opinion, was evocative of a more Catholic ethos of priest-congregation interplay. This is actually what Cantor Rosenbaum said 30 years ago, and he was no stranger to art music and loving all the choral forms, you know. He said, "You must understand that what charges a piece of vocal music with spiritual significance, what changes an aria into a prayer, what stokes the spiritual fires of the Hazzan and the congregant alike, is the instinctive and instructive feedback which each gives to the other." When people ask nowadays, as they should, for services to be more participatory, it is because the original participatory interplay of actual davening is either dead or stifled by the disconnected nature of the priestly activities of synagogue music, whose conception of music encourages the listener-performer relationship of the early Catholic or of the Middle Age Catholic Church. This is not to say that artistic music has no place in synagogue. On the contrary, I'm saying that at a minimum, religious music is not just for people, but also for God. But the individual obligation of each Jew to pray should not be effaced, symbolically or otherwise, by the musical edifice of worship. And I'm not pointing fingers at any one particular person, but that's my feeling looking at what davening is. Now, to conclude, we've seen that music itself is not some unequivocal boon from the gods in the Torah. It is a technology. It is a form of power that theologizes through its different forms and envisions different dichotomous ways of feeling and seeing the world. Order versus disorder. Noise versus harmony. Hierarchy versus equity. Priest and prophet. Music for God versus music for people. Written culture versus oral culture, which we barely even touched on. These, to me, comprise some of the poles of a religious view of music and its implications in suggesting ways of living. You can take the positives and the negatives of each. Take the nigun, which we started with, which I wrote, which we all love. Not that nigun, but we all love singing nigunim. The contemporary nigun should be a standard part of every Shaliach Tzibur's toolkit, in my opinion, because we're living in an era where community needs to be re-empowered and reconstituted. But think deeper about what does a nigun in its pure form mean. It means perhaps that we all are vocally equal before God, and that we should not vocally separate ourselves or make ourselves louder than the community. Actually, I think Joey Weisenberg has just come out with a board manual which involves nigunim and alignment and communication techniques for boards and synagogues and nonprofits to work together with nigunim. It's fascinating. But the form nigun also means that our connection to God transcends words, which are not required parts of the nigun. It's primarily about emotions. That's how we all connect to each other in our diversity, through shared emotions. But conversely, the nigun by itself also implies that the words of Judaism are settled beyond one's emotions, and an individual really has nothing to say. Ted Gioia, in his book Music, A Subversive History, points out this amazing observation from historian Johann Huizinga. Quote, Huizinga once made the brilliant observation that the age of knights and chivalry, which we all love, go to a Renaissance festival, ended when drums were introduced into military campaigns. The drum instilled uniformity and solidarity, not like the Nigun, right, into troops, but at the expense of the individual personalities that loom so large in war narratives of an earlier day. And so too with the transition toward drummed, heavy rhythm-based worship today, the chivalric era of the golden age of cantors, which involved a degree of focus and belief in the individual gifts of prayer leaders, that has been drummed out of us as our worship has gotten more and more rhythmic. Even as we attempt to rekindle unity and solidarity among Jews through music, a degree of individuality is effaced. And so too the musics of hierarchy, which have chiefly, at least in the last 70, 80 years, been chiefly championed by cantors and Jewish choirs to some extent. What do they mean? At best, these forms mean that our musical gifts are of theological significance, and that we should use them in worship and beyond as acts of hidur mitzvah, to point the beautiful towards the good. That's what I learned growing up at Agudas Achim, where my abilities as a musician, as a specialized musician, were consistently and effectively channeled into something Jewish, liturgical or cultural. But as we know, when disconnected from the people, musics of hierarchy, like all hierarchies, suffer rot and excess and start to look more like Catholic music theology than one which believes in individual chiyuv. Looking back into history, this was even a complaint of Solomon Zolzer's own rabbi. Though he domesticated the wild cantorial improvisations of traveling European cantors in the 1700s, Zolzer didn't still provide enough congregational singing for his own rabbi Yaakov Mannheimer. For cantors, we often speak of a golden age, right? Some of it's pictured on the left here. But we should peer into the history of golden ages. Hear this quote from the historian J.G.A. Pocock as he describes Edward Gibbon's, a British historian's, depiction of the Roman Empire at the time of Juvenal. Quote, "In so paradoxical a vision of history, there were no golden ages, but only golden moments at which the creative had not yet begun to destroy. Gibbon's Age of the Antonines is a silver moment of this kind, a moment of relaxation in the downward swing of a civilization." And so too, we should be wary of the permissiveness, which is the other side of inclusivity, of hierarchical models, which often can create power through art, but also foster civilizational decay. Back to reading Rainbow as I actually conclude. What Walensky suggests actually is that, equity and hierarchy are both acceptable forms of government. Moses' genius was actually creating a synthesis of the two, of hierarchy and equity, in and amongst the people Israel. And as a shaliach tzibur, a musician, and a cantor, exploring this from a musical perspective, I also think that we need both to save our own communities from the excesses of either, which we feel so acutely in our own era of polarization. And I am now happy to entertain your comments and your questions. Thank you so much for learning with me about musics of hierarchy and equity and the theologies behind our music.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to unmute everyone for just a second, and then I'm going to mute you again, but this time you're going to attempt to do that. I'm still, okay, so, I'm just allowing you to unmute yourselves if you like, but you don't have to unmute yourself. Okay, so I'll take questions, but I do see that there was a question in the chat that says, from Barbara Elkin, where do you see the role of a cantor evolving now?
Thank you. So I think that cantors, and I could give another 2 hours on this, but let me try to be very succinct. I think that cantors are actually, in some ways, some of the only cogent, coherent remaining champions of musics of hierarchy embedded in synagogue communities. A lot of what happens in Jewish music today is a bunch of mega artists who are, because it's not that, that synagogues and the Jewish world doesn't need more music. It does. It's just pushed a lot of that R&D outside the synagogue, because the synagogue is about making relationships and about making the organization work and about also learning Torah and other stuff like that and praying. But specialized music has been pushed to places outside the synagogue, like the Rising Song Institute, like SLBC. And this is not to diminish the work of cantors who like our own Hazzan Elisheva and hundreds throughout the country, are doing wonderful, innovative things, in their community. But I think that the role of the cantor, by default, is actually one of the champions of written music traditions, of ethnic and normative music traditions, and of even the interplay between Western and Ashkenazi music traditions, or Western and Sephardi music traditions. And so I don't know if I would call up someone from RSI or SLBC necessarily, although it's a very diverse community, to help me find a cello piece for my classical trained bar mitzvah student, but I know I can call a cantor about that. So I think the cantors are really sort of one of the last holdouts, and I think an important one, of music sub-hierarchy, and in using those well, both in not secular context, in the sacred context, and in secular context, and giving people content that's culturally relevant, which is a portal and the way in to the religious spirit of Judaism. But I also see that, we live in a time of an increasing need for equity. People are feeling very disconnected, and so nigunim and writing them and singing them are fundamental glue for reconstituting community. And there's no way of avoiding it. It's not killing chazanis. It's not killing anything. It's getting people together so you actually can have a foundational relational vocabulary for everything else. I'll end this comment on a little story. I won't tell the whole story. There's a Hasidic story about the Baal Shem Tov, and he's leading prayer. And the end of it is that it's a very long story about a multicolored bird. I really can't tell all of it. But the end of it is that we usually think of the Shliach Tzibur, the cantor, as being like Atlas, holding up this pyramid of people with his or her strength. But really, it's an opposite. It's an inverted pyramid. We usually think of it as an inverted pyramid with the cantor holding everything up like Atlas. But really, it's a pyramid where the cantor is at the top. And the cantor's ability, or the Shliach Tzibur's ability, to get real prayer is based on a relational foundation. It's based on educational foundation. It's based on everything you've done before you get to shul. And so, that's why nigunim are so important, and why communal building is so important, is because you can't get there without a foundation. You can't just have the form and expect the cantor to carry it upside down.
Thank you, Matt. Does anyone else have a question? You could just go ahead and unmute yourself and talk, since not everybody's jumping on. Okay, or you can put something in the chat. I know there's a lot to think about here, Matt. You have so much to teach us, and what a blessing it is to have you back in the community. I can't wait to hear you daven with us. Again, for those of you who weren't here before, we have postponed all of the Shabbat Shirah programming to March 25th and 26th, that Shabbat. And then the weekend will conclude on Sunday, March 27th, with a concert in the evening. So you all can come back, and that will most everything is available virtually and in person. We have a question from Jerry Friedman. Where is the use of instrumental music going in synagogue service practice, U.S. and abroad?
So thank you. Cantors always love the instruments question. We always get it, and it's a good question, right? I think that instruments are kind of going in two ways. In a lot of the non-Orthodox world, they're becoming very normative for worship, because we're trying to just create, because they support an Americanized melodic framework, which of all this sort of new folk songs and folk ethos repertoire and camp repertoire that's come into synagogues, especially since the 80s. Like now all of the people, the cantors and the rabbis and the lay people that were the song leaders 50 years ago, like their grandchildren are now the song leaders. So it's 2 degrees more normative, that now guitar is like de rigueur in the cantorial schools, whereas before it was like, this is the folk, this is the Amaharitz, kind of stuff. And so I think there's a gradual Americanization of repertoire, which calls forth a more guitar-like or instrumental fabric. But I also think, this actually relates to my own research. I study for my PhD right now, writing my dissertation on the years 1500 to 1800. And it's during this period, actually, that people begin to use instruments, not on Shabbat, but our Kabbalat Shabbat. In Prague, they would do hour-long concerts. There were organs in like 9 synagogues in Prague. There was a rabbi organ builder in 1594. These guys, because, and this is when the Chadodi comes out. This is the environment of Lurianic Kabbalah, when people need to feel joy, when your emotions matter. And with the rise of Kabbalah, your emotional state started to matter in prayer more than it had in a very long time. You had to have kavanah, you had to have intention, but that you should have joy, right? Because, you just followed a false messiah, Shabbatai Tzvi, or, you had pogroms, or, you had this and that. There was a move towards using instruments as a way, as a Kabbalistic and mystical way to inspire joy. And so I think today, when we have a new sort of emo ethos of like trying to connect people through their emotions, it's the same. You can hear it in sort of like the ethos of a lot of nigunim and communal singing tunes today. Is very therapy. It's therapy. It's music therapy live, but with God's stamp on it. So that desire for instruments comes from the desire to really make sure that joy, that feeling is there. And so you see it in some of these emergent places like SLBC, and especially Rising Song, which is sort of teeters between conservative and modern Orthodox, of a welcoming of sensitive use of instruments in a liturgical context even now. Whereas I think it was very Pasnish before, that for Kabbalat Shabbat from Lev Malchus, for the seams of the service at the ends, that instruments can be used to enhance spirituality, and it's not just a symbol of the other anymore. Even though there is, at least in those more orthonormative or davening normative places, still an emphasis on the community and on the individual relationship to davening, and that it can't be even just someone whamming away on the guitar. The communal voice has to come up first. You have to hear the person around you. It's not enough to hear the guitar really loud. So that sensitivity and sense of individual chiyuv, I think, animates another part of the instrumental side of worship today.
Thank you, Matt. Does anyone else have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, Sam.
Yeah. Well, in this time frame, I've been shul hopping since I can't go to my own synagogue, and I thought I'd try and expand my visions of the Jewish services around. And in New York at Park Avenue and B'nai Jeshurun, they both added instruments to the Shabbat service. Maybe it's because I was brought up in a Reform temple in Providence back in the 40s and 50s. I don't have a problem with it. I personally think that it adds to the service, to the beauty and to the joy of the service.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm glad you've been able to get around. Matt, go ahead.
I think that, that instrument, it's like anything when you have more power. More power, it takes more, the more power you put in, the more you have to move it in one direction or another. To keep it focused. So I think with instruments, it's the same way. I have been to instrumental services that have really participated in a concert ethos completely, and that is the feeling that you have. And I have been to instrumental services which feel where the instruments are a little more humble, and I can tell that the congregation's voice is first. So the more complex you get, the more careful you have to get. It's kind of like why I think instrumental stuff is Levitical, because the Levites were one step closer to God. They were more restricted in their lives, and I think instruments should be restricted in how they are used in services, if they're used at all. But there's more, because they're having more power, more holiness. So I think that instruments can be good. I just think that they can more easily be mistaken as something that they're not, especially the more that you get of them.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, Matt, I'm going to first of all, thank you so much for coming back home to virtually to teach us. What an honor it is to be able to learn from you. So thank you. And I was wondering if you would please bring us out the way you brought us in, which is with that same nigun that you did. I think that would be a beautiful way to end.
Thank you so much. I'll sing this Nigun again when I come for the concert with the LZ. I'll be doing a lot of original music there, and my wife also, Rabbi Alyssa, will also do some of her original music as well. And thank you again for joining me. Hidi dum dum dio, hidi dum dum dio. Ay 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 bye bye. Hidi dum dum dio, hidi dum dum dio. Ay 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 bye bye. If you want this in shul, this goes well too. Adon olam asher molach b'terem kol yitzir nivra. להתנסה בחפצו כל, אזי מלך שמו נקרא. Skipping to the end. בידו הפקיד רוחי, בייתי שן ביעירה, ועם רוחי גוויעתי, אדוני לי ולא יירא. Idi dum bum bye, idi other dum die, oh, oi, 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 bye bye, idi dum bum bye, oh, idi other dum die, oh, oi, 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 Iowa. Erev Tov, everybody.
Erev Tov, thank you.